Imagine exploring Italy with an art historian, or cruising Alaska's Inside Passage with a renowned geologist. When you travel with Smithsonian Journeys, you gain a deeper understanding of the world's fascinating places. Find a wide range of river cruises, classic land journeys, hiking trips, and more at smithsonianjourneys.org or by calling 855-330-1542. Your participation benefits the important work of the Smithsonian. Visit smithsonianjourneys.org/podcast to request your free catalog. On a cool, damp day last fall, Andrea Haudemacki traveled to the Sierra Nevada region of Northern California.
I drove up here in this majestic pine forest, low-hanging clouds and mist still in the trees.
She was there to meet a special kind of neighborhood association.
It felt like a group of friends hanging out in a morning to do something together outside. They had some music playing. The fellow whose house it was brought out a table and set up a little umbrella and brought out some pizza and some cold drinks.
All around this group of people were piles of burning wood. But this wasn't a campfire. This was a prescribed burn. Prescribed burns, or controlled burns as they're sometimes called, are planned mini forest fires that can actually prevent larger, more destructive fires from occurring. Andrea recently wrote about them for Smithsonian Magazine. She also photographed this group of people responsible for overseeing the burn.
Each person was taking over a couple of different piles, and as the fire goes down, they're raking on some extra, leaves or some branches, sitting around and just catching up, keeping an eye on a fire, but also enjoying some pizza.
Prescribed burns are gaining momentum as a possible solution to dangerous wildfires. The idea is to thin out things like underbrush and low tree limbs that are so good at stoking wildfire.
So when a forest is too dense, it's also less resilient to fires and the changes that we're seeing in today's climate. The prescribed fire is really about preemptive management. So by clearing out those thick underbrush and fuels, they're able to have less intense wildfires.
It's been a record year for wildfires with horrific blazes all over the globe. Maui, Canada, Australia, just to name a few. Even those of us that live far from the epicenter of these fires spent a lot of the summer breathing their smoke. You may have read about the COP28 UN climate conference that's happening now as we release this episode. Well, things have gotten so dire that this group is currently talking about wildfires and other climate-related events as major public health issues. So what do we do? Are prescribed burns the answer? And how did we get here in the first place? From Smithsonian Magazine and PRX Productions, this is There's More to That, the show where we try to predict the future by learning from the past. On this episode, how to fight fire with fire in a changing climate. I'm Chris Klimek. The holidays are coming, and SmithsonianStore.com has gifts for everyone on your list. Find museum-inspired jewelry, home goods, clothing, books, toys, and more. Save 10% and get free shipping when you go to SmithsonianStore.com and enter the promo code PODCAST at checkout. All profits support the Smithsonian's mission. Remember to use code PODCAST when you shop SmithsonianStore.com today. Don't wait. Offer valid only for a limited time. New from Smithsonian Books, Space Shuttle Stories, First-Hand Astronaut Accounts from All 135 Missions, by NASA astronaut Tom Jones. Experience all NASA Space Shuttle missions through the words of the astronauts themselves in this spectacularly illustrated volume with more than 600 photos from the NASA archives. This guide is perfect for fans of space history and space flight. Space Shuttle Stories is available wherever books are sold. Before we get back to Andrea and the prescribed burns, let's find out more about why wildfires happen and why they seem to be getting worse. John Valiant is a writer and journalist based between Canada and the US. His latest book, Fire Weather: A True Story from a Hotter World, was a 2023 National Book Award finalist. The book is about the devastating 2016 wildfire in Fort McMurray, Canada.
It was so big, it created a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, which are these huge fireborne storm systems that puncture the stratosphere. They're these massive entities that generate their own lightning, biblical apocalypse, volcanic chaos, Ragnarok type stuff. The power of this fire, despite the fact that the local lakes were still frozen, that there were car-sized blocks of ice on the Athabasca River while this fire was raging around it. This Southern California intensity fire was sweeping through this community that literally had had frost 5 days earlier. So I thought, this is really weird.
John's book was published before the massive fires that plagued Canada over the summer.
I certainly never imagined that fire weather would actually come out the same year that Canada would burn as it never had before.
We turned to John for some on-the-ground reporting about these intense fires.
We're getting a respite, finally, and this is after an absolutely relentless season that really started at the end of April, was going full blast across the country by May, and never stopped. So this has been a historic season for us. We burnt 10 times the average amount of forest this year. And we had 250,000 citizens on the road, evacuated, tens of thousands more standing by, ready to run, and several communities burnt to the ground. So it's been an absolutely terrible summer, really the worst ever.
I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C. I mean, we were reading a few months ago that the source of a lot of the smoke that, was palpable in our atmosphere was originating from Canadian wildfires. How is that possible?
Well, when you get as much of Quebec burning and as much of Ontario burning and as much of Nova Scotia burning as was burning in late May and early June, you kind of can't believe the emissions. So just to give you an idea, Canada is a massive emitter of industrial CO2 because we're one of the biggest petroleum producers in the world. And we also have the tar sands, which are uniquely heavy emitters. The fires of 2023 in Canada produced 3 times our industrial emissions. And that is just way off the charts. So you get that much smoke in the air, and then it's air currents. Jet stream is a factor, which is really like a conveyor, but these are all these kind of compounding issues around climate change, because one of the very strong indicators of a climate in distress is our now unpredictable jet stream, which used to go around the Northern Hemisphere in a fairly consistent conveyor belt-like way. Now it's moving more like a Mississippi River meander. It goes up and it goes down, and smoke, along with temperature, can get pushed into places where it wouldn't ordinarily be. That said, I think even without a wonky jet stream, so much forest was burning in late May and June that everybody was going to get some. I mean, Spain got it, France got it. And that was Canadian smoke that literally crossed the Atlantic Ocean and shrouded the west side of the European continent. It was a massive smoke pall, and I'm sorry to say the eastern seaboard really got caught in the middle of it.
Are we getting to a place where even the expression fire season is an antiquated idea, where it's no longer confined to these specific months?
I'm afraid so. Yeah, I think in California now, you can talk to members of CAL FIRE, which is the state firefighting agency, and you can talk to people who've been there 20 years. And even in the past 20 years, they will say, well, we used to have a 4-month fire season, and now it pretty much runs year round. And then the difference now would just be intensity. And then again, they had 300% snowpack in the southern part of the state. And so they've had one of the lightest fire seasons they've had in years because all the reservoirs filled up after nearly a dozen years of drought. So we have no idea if that will be predictable. It's almost certain, though, that it won't be. So we'll get some other extreme. And right now, even in Alberta, which is a subarctic province, so you're way up there, but they're having fires up there now in the winter because snowfall is reduced. There's been kind of a steady trend of that. And then that's exacerbated by El Nino systems, which impact interior continental weather. And so now we've got another El Nino coming, and they tend to move in 2-year pulses, if you will, the second year being even more severe than the first. So that all points to Alberta, which had a terrible fire season this year, having a potentially even worse season in 2024. And that's a daunting prospect.
I'm sure it's a confluence of factors, but can we identify a few things that might be responsible for the wildfires this year being so much more intense and difficult to contain?
We certainly can. And so we're crossing invisible thresholds that we are barely aware of. Our climate is changing in some obvious and measurable ways, but it's having effects that are not obvious. Really, for the past 50 years, there has been a steady warming. And that warming became more pronounced in the late 90s. And then we really started seeing some significant spikes and departures through the early 2000s. 2023 has been a signal year for bizarre climate indicators. And Canada's fire season was one manifestation of that. One of the ways these thresholds manifest themselves is in quiet ways that are not so obvious to us, but are very obvious to fire. And so one example would be in the Alberta Boreal. These are these northern forests, lots of poplar, lots of aspen, lots of black spruce. But there's also a lot of bog in there, a lot of swamp. We call it muskeg in Canada. People have been doing test pits in some of these muskeg bogs in Alberta, and they have been dry 6 feet down. And that is super strange and deeply alarming because most of the tree roots are shallow. So that means all the tree roots are dry. And when you dry out a bog, you get peat. And when you think of what, Irish people have traditionally burned, what people all across Northern Europe have burned in past centuries, it's dried peat. And ordinarily, in order to dry it, you dig it out of the ground. It's sort of decayed plant matter that's on its way to becoming coal, but that's going to take thousands and thousands of years. But right now, it's decayed, compressed plant matter that if you dry it out in the air and the sun, you can burn it like wood. So now that stuff is drying in situ, which means you have this reservoir of fuel that can burn 12 months a year, virtually endlessly. You can't put them out. So this is, again, a long journey into the weeds, but a huge amount of Alaska, a huge amount of northern Canada, a huge amount of northern Europe is composed of this kind of bog. And when it dries out, not only does it release methane and CO2, but it also can catch on fire and stay on fire in really durable ways.
So beyond just, my home is threatened by a wildfire, what are the human health effects of increasing prevalence and intensity of wildfires?
Oh, they're really dramatic. When New York and the eastern seaboard was shrouded in smoke for a number of days around the beginning of June, the number of people reporting to emergency rooms for pulmonary and cardiac issues spiked. If you're a relatively healthy person who doesn't have asthma, you can just weather it. You might cough a little bit and you might blow your nose and get a funny color, but generally you're going to be fine. But elders, babies, people with any kind of compromised health, when you add that much smoke to the system, it can put people over the edge from a stable but not ideal health situation to a really grievous health risk. And so what it does, the same way many disasters do, the most vulnerable parts of the landscape, the most vulnerable species, and the most vulnerable people will be hit first. And that's what we're seeing. And likewise, in the case of prolonged smoke inhalation, for example, if you were in Slave Lake in the Northwest Territories, that's a small city of about 20,000 people, way in the far north of Canada, that evacuated due to the fires in August, I believe. But they were in smoke basically all summer long. And so there are going to be measurable health impacts, not just on the old and the young and the vulnerable, but on the general population.
During our conversation, John identified one surprising reason for the increase in intense wildfires. He said that we don't let some forest fires burn enough.
Fire suppression is a legitimate culprit for one of the reasons our fire seasons have been so bad in North America. The good fire, as some people call it, has been taken off the land. And generally, what you see in a healthy forest where fire has been used in a seasonal and rhythmic way is a lot more space. And so when a small fire can go through, it'll burn the small brush, it'll burn the grass, but it won't run up into the trees and start a crown fire, which is what's almost guaranteed to happen now because there's so many ladder fuels, as they're called, choking the forest floor. And so that's what you see, less so on the East Coast, but in the West, people clearing out the underbrush in between the larger trees in a forest, and then burning at safe times of year smaller fires through the forest floor to kind of clean it up. It's a kind of sweeping, really. It's a fire used properly and rhythmically acts as a broom in the forest.
I was a little confounded when you named fire suppression as one of the factors we were facing here. So forest firefighting organizations, broadly, how do they decide when they want to intervene directly and when it would be better to just let a fire burn itself out?
Yeah, that whole culture is really changing.
John said the catalyst for this shift came in 1988 when Yellowstone National Park caught fire.
Half the park burned. And there was a huge debate then. Do we let it burn or do we put it out? And you're younger than I am, but growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Smokey Bear was an icon, right up there with Mickey Mouse.
I do remember Smokey Bear, yes.
You put fires out every time you saw one, and that's what the Forest Service did too. And so letting Yellowstone burn back in that terrible fire, I think it was 86, was a kind of historic event. All this to say, since then, there has been a more open and often heated, if you'll pardon the pun, debate around whether to let the fires burn or not. And so now, at this point here in 2023, we're at a place where there's an increasing tendency to let the fire burn unless it's going to intrude into settled areas and threaten important infrastructure. There's a better understanding now that a healthy forest is one that has fires in it. And right now, because there is this massive buildup of forest due to nearly a century of quite successful fire suppression, the forests are now overloaded. And then you have rising temperatures and dropping humidity. And that skews the way fire would naturally burn in several different ways that create these catastrophic conditions that we increasingly find ourselves in.
To learn more about the history of these prescribed burns and how they work, we called Andrea Haudemacke, who you heard at the beginning of the episode. Andrea seemed to live light years away from my Washington, D.C. apartment.
I used to have to ride a horse to be able to make a phone call. So to be able to sit here and talk to you is fantastic.
I couldn't help but notice an unfamiliar noise behind her on the call. What are we hearing in your office right now?
You're hearing a wood-burning stove. I live on a cattle ranch in southern Chile most of the year. No relation necessarily with the story, just how we're able to keep our off-grid house warm.
We began our conversation by getting into more of the benefits and mechanics of prescribed burns. Can we talk about any animals living in the forest where a controlled burn is initiated? Do we know how they're affected by this?
Yeah, so controlled burns happen at particular times of year, usually either in the spring or in the fall. And the timing of the burns takes into account bird migration as well as the direction the smoke is going to travel. And the large mammals in the controlled burn context are generally able to leave or escape the area because it's a slower moving fire. Now, the fire itself, though, is actually helpful for the wildlife because instead of having these thick areas of dense vegetation where maybe a deer can't get through, you're opening up those areas and creating more of a mosaic. So there's different vegetation and different spaces for the animals to go. It's also really good for the pollinators and for the bird populations. You're opening up that forest floor and you're being able to release some seeds, and when those wildflowers are able to come up, that's a really important nectar source for your pollinators. It kind of rejuvenates the forest.
Let's talk about that a bit more. Why do forest ecosystems need fires to thrive?
Wildfire and fire has always been part of the North American landscape. Most of the North American ecosystems is actually fire dependent. I mean, even from the East Coast down to Florida, across to the Great Plains, into the Western United States, all of that landscape used to have fire on it. Now, traditionally, indigenous peoples would light fires or allow maybe a lightning strike to burn out, and that historically was the way that these ecosystems were managed. When fire was taken off the landscape in the early 1900s, that's when we started seeing an increase of all this vegetation and an overgrowth, both in the forest context and in the grassland context. Now, as we've increased our cities and the spread of where humans live, it becomes a more challenging situation that now we're dealing with wildfire, not just going through a forest, but communities. And so it's really important to bring back that fire to these landscapes and recreate under a controlled system the type of fire that naturally occurred.
When Andrea says that fire was taken off the landscape in the 1900s, she's referring to a federally controlled burn ban, which lasted for decades. But now, Andrea says there's been a shift, and government agencies responsible for land management are once again considering prescribed burns as a fire prevention tool.
So what we've transitioned to now today is less so much of a suppression focus, but there's an increased focus on including good fire, so that would be the prescribed fires, into the management that's used across the U.S. It's a technique also that ranchers have used, particularly in California. Ranchers used fire to clear out healthy areas for grazing for livestock. As far as prescribed burn associations, now that's a little bit newer development.
Prescribed burn associations, or PBAs as they're sometimes called, started popping up in the 1990s, first in the Great Plains and then beyond. PBAs are a group of ordinary citizens that get together to share their resources and collaboratively prevent fires by setting fires on privately owned land. Don't worry, they do this with proper training, and these fires are very closely planned and monitored.
Oftentimes the barriers to fire is that you need to have enough knowledge, you have to have the right equipment, you have to have the resources to be able to do it safely. And so with the PBAs, the neighbors are coming together and they're pooling those resources so that they can undertake these prescribed fires on their own land.
Do we know where the idea for PBAs came from?
In the mid-90s, John Weir, he was an extension specialist at Oklahoma State University. He frequently did prescribed fire out at the Oklahoma State University research range. Neighbors were repeatedly calling him and asking for help, and what he realized is that he didn't actually need to go and burn for these people. He needed to educate them on how they could go and do a prescribed fire safely on their property. So from the Great Plains area, kind of started to develop this PBA model.
Plumas Underburn Cooperative is a direct descendant of that model. Today, it's one of an estimated 22 prescribed burn associations in the state of California. Andrea photographed the Plumas Underburn Cooperative for her article, Traveling to Plumas County, a forested, mountainous region of Northern California about 2 hours north of Lake Tahoe.
It's in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and you've got steep slopes, you've got some beautiful vine forests and rivers. It's a place where you would maybe want to go to camp or to hike, and a beautiful community-oriented place to live. It seems like a place where everybody knows everybody.
What is their relationship to wildfires in Plumas County?
Plumas County had an extremely destructive wildfire in 2021, and that was the Dixie Fire. It unfortunately engulfed the town of Greenville. I think the Dixie Fire was the second largest fire in California history. When I went and photographed the prescribed burn that's in this story, there was, at least on a local level or a neighbor level, a really renewed focus by folks who are interested in incorporating prescribed fire into their communities. They saw that that was something that could be helpful as a way to protect themselves by creating kind of buffer zones or safe spaces around their homes and around their towns. The Dixie Fire was a very hot and very intense burning fire. Now, when you have a forest fire that's a catastrophic or an extremely intense burning fire, instead of preserving those old growth trees, it's just going to incinerate everything in its path because of the intense heat. These prescribed burns or controlled burns, the benefit is that it's a low intensity fire. It's not scorching everything in its side. Oftentimes it's called an underburn, and so that's when the fire creeps across on the bottom of the forest floor, cleaning up some old leaf litter. It's cleaning up this layer of forest duff, and it's about creating a healthier environment for those trees and for the plants on the forest floor.
And what makes these groups effective versus, government agencies or more formal organizations? Why do PBAs seem to work?
PBAs are a complement to the agencies. The agencies do a lot of work on public land. The prescribed burn associations are really helpful both in states that have a lot of private land, so maybe like, Nebraska or Oklahoma, where if you're actually going to get prescribed fire on that land, an agency can't go and do it because they don't own that land, but private property owners can. And then the other reason that PBAs can be really effective, especially in areas like Plumas County, is that we're talking about an area that people are living within a wilderness type area. And so they're able to do fire around their land and their homes on kind of a micro scale in a closer in area to protect these urban areas that maybe the agencies isn't going to be getting into.
Many of the members of the Plumas Underburn Collective remember the Dixie Fire well.
There's one gentleman who is in the story. His name is Jeff Grief, and he has a really unique story about how he used that preventative work to actually save his home when the Dixie Fire came through. He did this prep work on his property where he had completed an underburn, and he'd done some thinning to increase the health of his forest. And so when the Dixie Fire came up over the ridge where his house is situated, it just kind of died down when it got to his property. You can't say that that sort of prep work is always going to save your house, but it definitely helped the resiliency of his home. And if he hadn't done that work, the outcome might have been different.
What do you do to prepare for a prescribed burn?
All of the prescribed burns have a burn plan, and they also often have an experienced leader who's called a burn boss that would be the point person or the person who is in charge of the fire that day. The major factors that they're taking into account would be the weather. Is it an appropriate temperature? What's the humidity? And then also the wind speeds. If there's too much wind, then it wouldn't be safe to burn that day. They're taking into account the description of the area. What's the topography? Is it steep? Is it flat? That's going to impact the direction that the fire is going to go. Different states have different rules about when you can burn and what sort of paperwork needs to be turned in. But the burn plans that folks have to turn in before they do this prescribed fire require a lot of thought and planning. They have to often state the objective, like why do we want to do a burn on this particular property and how is it going to benefit? That's just the planning stage. After that, then they have to do the prep work where they need to make a perimeter around the outside of where the prescribed burn is going to happen to make sure the fire doesn't go outside of that area. And then on the inside of the burn area, they might also be trimming the lower limbs of trees so that the prescribed fire doesn't climb up the trees, or they might be piling up some downed logs and really preparing the ground before they even go in and burn that day. The individual that I photographed in the story, he said he spent, I think, over 40 hours of prep work getting ready for the pile burn that happened with just, a few hours on a morning with some friends.
A pile burn is a type of controlled burn. It's almost exactly what it sounds like. After the precautionary clearing of the area, logs are stacked up and burned in piles. Andrea told us it was lucky she got to photograph one at all.
One of the challenges both to photograph prescribed fire and also for the folks who do prescribed fire is that weather is such a huge factor. There were several times where I was planning to go out and photograph and to get the call that morning or like on your way to driving to prescribed fire and it's like, oh, we called it off. And, it's a good reason that they do that because it's all about safety and making sure that the burn can be done safely. But that is one of the challenges both of reporting on prescribed fire and also for the folks that are doing the on-the-ground work. The pile burn that happened this day was adjacent to like a neighboring property. So you could definitely see where Sailor, who is the landowner, how he'd done the prep work. You could see where he'd cleaned out some small trees and you could see where he'd cut off some lower limb branches and some of the mature trees. And you could see where he'd piled up logs and cut big logs up into chunks so that they were movable. Because if you looked on the adjacent property, you could see where there were just logs still strewn over the forest floor. It looked more unkempt, I guess you could say.
How did they actually start the fire?
So they use blow torches. And you can smell the drip torch fuel. And then it also was a damp day, so you've kind of got that like wet forest smell that just is real nice. You can hear the crackle of the pine needles. They kind of make a crackling sound when they burn. You can kind of smell that kind of like earthy singe of that coming up. And then you've got the burning of the logs. You can hear them kind of falling down on each other inside the pile. And then there was that music that was going on in the background where it just kind of felt like a bunch of people hanging out in the woods and just enjoying a morning and listening to some music. As you're photographing, you don't want to get too close to the flames, but you've kind of got those gases coming off the fire. And so it's creating like a nebulous looking effect of the people that you're photographing through the fire. Yeah, you can hear the crackle and the snap of the wood burning. On a controlled setting like this, it kind of just feels like you're at a giant campfire. I was glad that I had arrived early so that I could photograph the piles when you could still see them, because when it was all done, you could kind of see some little bits of smoke coming off the hillside from where the piles were, but it was not nearly as impressive as seeing all of the stacked wood that they'd prepared to burn that morning.
As the fires died down and the music played, Andrea found herself witnessing a sense of community.
There was one fella, I think it was his 70th birthday, and that was what he was doing that morning. And then in the afternoon, he was going to go celebrate with family and friends. I feel like from talking to folks, prescribed fire, especially in the PBAs, it's a way for people to connect that maybe gives them a reason to get together, and that they wouldn't necessarily make the time to go and hang out with their neighbors unless they had this group project that they were doing together.
Are there any drawbacks to prescribed burns?
Yeah, I mean, when you're working with fire, there's always challenges. There are incidences of when prescribed fires have escaped their boundaries. Maybe one of the more recent ones would be the Hermit Peak fire that was in New Mexico. Some unexpected erratic winds caused the fire to jump outside of the boundary. But from my conversations with the people who work from the academic side of research and forest health, the benefits, the need for the forest to have fire outweigh the risks. And when these agencies or when these landowners are taking all the responsible preconditions to be able to burn safely, generally the prescribed fire has a good safety record.
Well, we know wildfires seem to be increasing. Do you think controlled burns will increase in a commensurate way as a way of controlling them?
There's a lot of interest right now. So in October of 2021, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed Senate Bill 332 into effect, and that was to encourage more prescribed burning by minimizing the associated liabilities. The interesting thing about prescribed fire is that it's bringing together some really diverse groups. So on that particular bill, you had support from the California Cattlemen's Association, you had support from the Karuk tribe, you had support from the Defenders of Wildlife. So all of these different organizations, from the ranchers to the environmental groups to the indigenous groups, see and value prescribed fire and the benefits that it can bring to the land.
Andrea Hadamaki is a photojournalist. Thank you so much, Andrea, for speaking with us today.
Thanks. It was great to be here.
To read an excerpt of John's book, Fire Weather, and to see Andrea's photographs of the Plumas County Underburn Collective, head to SmithsonianMag.com. We've also put links in our show notes, along with a list of resources where you can learn more about prescribed burns. Before we let you go, we have a dinner party fact to send you off into the rest of your week. We're hoping you can use this week's fact instead of a cheesy pickup line, although it's not about something conventionally romantic.
Hey there, I'm Jenny Rothenberg-Gritz. I'm a senior editor at Smithsonian Magazine. And my dinner party fact might come in handy if you find an attractive person at the next dinner party you attend. It's a seduction technique I learned from an article I recently worked on about birds. So apparently, when a male roadrunner sees a female that he wants to court, he comes forward with a dead animal hanging from his beak. It could be a dead lizard, or a centipede, or a dragonfly, or even a dead smaller bird. And apparently this is a very effective seduction technique because roadrunners mate for life. So you might want to try this.
Okay, Jenny, what else you got?
Another bonus fact I'll give you is that in spite of everything we've learned from cartoons, roadrunners cannot actually outrun coyotes. A roadrunner is fast. They can run about 25 miles an hour, but coyotes are even faster. They can run 35 to 43 miles per hour. So keep enjoying Looney Tunes, but please keep coming to Smithsonian for your science information.
There's More to That. It's a production of Smithsonian Magazine and PRX Productions. From the magazine, our team is me, Deborah Rosenberg, and Brian Wally. From PRX, our team is Jessica Miller, Genevieve Sponsler, Adriana Rosas Rivera, Ry Dorsey, and Edwin Ochoa. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. Our episode artwork is by Emily Lankowitz, fact-checking by Stephanie Abramson. Our music is from APM Music. I'm Chris Klimek. Thanks for listening.